I always thought family was supposed to be your safe place. The people who lift you when you fall, who cheer for your victories, who love you unconditionally. But that illusion shattered the day my parents handed my sister a check for $100,000 to buy her dream house and casually called me the family failure. I sat there, stunned, holding my lukewarm coffee, the walls of our luxurious living room suddenly closing in on me. Their words cut deeper than any insult ever could. Not a joke, not a passing comment, but a verdict. A label. A lifetime sentence of inadequacy. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but nothing came out. My throat constricted, my vision blurred, and a strange, cold clarity settled in my chest. I could feel the fire of humiliation flickering into something else, something sharper, more controlled. I wasn't just going to sit there and absorb their judgment. No. I was going to rise, and I was going to take control. My sister, Lily, skipped around the living room, giddy with excitement. I can't believe it. My own house. Mom, Dad, this is amazing, she gushed. And there I sat, invisible, a spectator in my own life. They didn't even ask how I was doing, whether I needed support, whether I had dreams. The only thing that mattered to them was Lily, the golden child, the one who excelled, succeeded, and never failed. I left the house that evening with nothing but my phone, my laptop, and a burning resolve. I didn't pack much. Why would I need possessions when I was taking everything I ever wanted from my own circumstances? I drove aimlessly, headlights cutting through the night, letting the city streets guide me as I tried to quiet the anger swirling inside. Every mile, every turn, every stoplight felt like a meditation. Humiliation, betrayal, injustice. I let it fuel me. The next morning, I found a small apartment in a new city, far enough that my parents couldn't drop in, far enough that I could breathe without judgment. I signed a lease, bought a second-hand laptop, and took my first freelance design gig, a modest paycheck, but one that reminded me that my worth wasn't determined by a $100,000 check or by the cruel labels my family pinned on me. Days turned into weeks. I started building something quiet, almost invisible. My portfolio, my clients, my reputation. And with each step, my confidence grew, not loudly, not vindicatively, but deliberately, like a fire stoked under cold ashes. I was learning that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's silent. Sometimes, it's patience. But the sting of betrayal never fully left. Every time my phone buzzed with a family group message, every time a relative posted a photo of Lily in her new house, the humiliation crept back. I would see the check they had given her, the house they had bought, the approval they had lavished, and I would feel that familiar hollow ache of invisibility. Then I noticed something. In the way they celebrated Lily, in the way they flaunted generosity selectively, there were cracks, tiny inconsistencies, whispers of financial tension, hints that maybe their money wasn't as freely flowing as it appeared. My curiosity sparked. I began to watch, listen, and take notes, quietly, carefully, like a predator circling prey. That was when I discovered emails and messages that revealed more than just favoritism. My parents had been manipulating family finances, shifting money, controlling who got what, using generosity as a weapon. And me. I was the scapegoat, the failure whose humiliation distracted from their own schemes. My anger turned into a cold, focused determination. I wasn't going to just survive, I was going to expose, reclaim, and rise. I began gathering evidence, bank statements, digital conversations, public filings, anything that could give me leverage. Every night, I worked tirelessly, piecing together a puzzle that my family had tried to hide. And with every document I collected, I realized that I had power that my sister and parents didn't even know existed. I could build a future for myself while keeping them blind to my strategy. It wasn't easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, haunted by memories of being dismissed, belittled, and ignored. I remembered the look on my mother's face as she handed Lily the check, her eyes glinting with pride while mine seemed to fade into the wallpaper. I remembered my father's dismissive chuckle, like I was some mistake in the family's grand design. And each recollection only strengthened my resolve. I was going to prove my worth, not to them, Not for their approval, but for me. I started to see the world differently. Humiliation was no longer a weapon against me. It was a mirror, reflecting exactly what I needed to change, to fight, and to overcome. The fire of betrayal became my compass, guiding me toward opportunity, strategy, and eventual power. By the time my small freelance projects began turning into significant contracts, I realized that I wasn't just surviving, I was building. And with every new client, every paycheck, every tiny victory, I felt my past humiliation receding. The label of family failure had no hold over me anymore. But I knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge wasn't just financial independence, it was reclaiming my narrative. My family had humiliated me publicly, written me off privately, and undermined me systematically. And I was going to show them that a failure could rise quietly, strategically, and completely beyond their expectations. Weeks turned into months, and my small apartment became both my refuge and my war room. The flickering light of my laptop at night became my constant companion, the quiet hum of the city below a reminder that life outside my parents' shadow was still moving, still possible. Every project I completed, every client who praised my work, every dollar I earned felt like a subtle rebellion against the humiliation I had endured. Then came the first real clue that my parents' generosity had a darker edge. While reviewing some old family emails that had been accidentally forwarded to me, I discovered conversations between my parents and their accountant. Talks about financial manipulation, favoring Lily while marginalizing me. They had deliberately labeled me a failure to cover up their control over the money, making me the family scapegoat while elevating Lily to a status that bordered on idolization. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. The humiliation wasn't personal, it was strategic. And if it was strategic, then it could be countered strategically. I decided to do more than just survive. I started documenting everything. Financial transactions, contracts, emails, even subtle messages that hinted at their manipulations. My plan wasn't born of petty revenge. It was born of necessity. I needed leverage. I needed proof that my worth was real, that I was not a failure, and that the narrative my parents had crafted around me was a lie. The emotional toll was heavy. Late nights, tears quietly shed into my pillow, the hollow ache of remembering their words and their disregard. "You'll never amount to anything," my father had said once, while my mother smirked in agreement. The sting of those words fueled me, sharpened my resolve. I refused to be their narrative anymore. I was rewriting my story, line by line, document by document. It wasn't long before the opportunity to confront them in a meaningful way presented itself. A family meeting was planned regarding some shared investments, and I knew this was my chance. Not to yell, not to cry, but to reveal truths that had been carefully hidden. I meticulously prepared my evidence. Financial records proving favoritism and mismanagement, contracts showing deliberate exclusion of me from family assets, and messages exposing manipulations that had tarnished my reputation. When the day arrived, I walked into the room, composed, calm, almost serene. My parents looked at me as they always did, dismissive, slightly condescending. Lily fluttered nearby, radiant in the center of attention, unaware of the storm that had quietly been brewing. But I had changed. The scared, humiliated girl who had sat quietly in the living room months ago was gone. In her place stood someone confident, poised, and ready. I began with subtle remarks, carefully probing, dropping hints. "I noticed a few inconsistencies in the way finances were handled recently," I said, letting the words hang. My mother smiled, assuming I was confused, naive. My father raised an eyebrow, masking unease with skepticism. I continued, slowly, methodically, presenting document after document, weaving a story that was impossible to ignore. The room shifted. Faces paled. The facade cracked. Their smug confidence, built over years, began to crumble. Each piece of evidence I revealed was a mirror, reflecting the truth they had tried to hide. Their laughter, once directed at me, was now replaced with tense silence. I watched, almost detached, as the power dynamics reversed. This was not about vengeance. I felt no joy in their discomfort. The real triumph was reclaiming control over my life, my dignity, and my future. I had transformed humiliation into strategy, betrayal into insight. Every calculated step, every sleepless night, every ounce of effort was paying off. After the meeting, my parents retreated, quiet and unsettled. Lily, confused, approached me, asking why I had been so forceful. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I realized that this moment was bigger than sibling rivalry. It was about fairness, recognition, and truth. Later that night, I reflected on everything. The anger that had once consumed me was replaced with clarity. I had learned that humiliation is temporary if met with strategy, that betrayal can be countered with patience, and that power is always strongest when wielded wisely. The journey wasn't over. Far from it. There were more challenges ahead, more confrontations to navigate, and more lessons to learn. But for the first time, I felt the sweet taste of control. I had reclaimed my narrative, shifted the family's power dynamics, and established a foundation upon which I could build my future, independently, unshaken, and undeniably strong. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt an unfamiliar peace. The family who had called me a failure would think twice before underestimating me again. I had turned humiliation into opportunity, weakness into strategy, and sorrow into resolve. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a larger transformation, one that would eventually allow me not only to survive but to thrive, on my own terms. The weeks that followed were a calculated dance of patience and observation. I no longer reacted impulsively. I watched, listened, and planned. Every conversation, every gesture, every careless slip from my parents or Lily became a thread in a tapestry I was quietly weaving. My humiliation had sharpened me, taught me to read between the lines, and recognize the subtle manipulations that once slipped past my notice. One evening, while reviewing financial records for a freelance client, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. My parents had shifted assets in ways that were technically legal but morally deceptive, favoring Lily in ways that went far beyond mere generosity. They had built an empire around favoritism, hiding their bias behind smiles and celebrations, and I realized this was my leverage. I began to strategize carefully. I would not attack recklessly. I would dismantle their influence with precision. I mapped out every relationship, every investment, every decision where their favoritism had hurt me. I began building legal and financial pathways that would not just prove their manipulations, but allow me to reclaim what was rightfully mine. And then came the first confrontation. I invited my father to meet me for coffee under the guise of reconciliation. He arrived, confident, smug, and dismissive, thinking I was still the same sister who had sat quietly in their living room, humiliated and overlooked. I let him talk, allowed him to bask in assumed superiority. Then, slowly, I began to expose the inconsistencies, referencing documents, contracts, and transactions he believed were invisible to me. The shift was instantaneous. His eyes widened. The smugness faltered. I watched him struggle to regain control, to charm, to dismiss, but the evidence was irrefutable. I wasn't asking for approval or acknowledgement. I was demonstrating truth. And that truth carried power. From that day, I sensed a change in the household dynamics. My parents, once entirely dismissive, began to approach me with caution. Lily, oblivious to the magnitude of the storm I had quietly prepared, continued to flaunt her privileges, unaware that her golden halo was beginning to tarnish under scrutiny. But the revenge arc wasn't about cruelty, it was about reclamation. Every step I took was calculated to restore my dignity, to prove my worth, and to illuminate the injustices I had suffered. I began leveraging my growing financial independence, investments I had made quietly, and clients who admired my skill and resilience. My parents had underestimated me. They didn't see the transformation that humiliation had triggered. The emotional toll, however, was still there. Some nights, I would collapse onto my bed, feeling the old ache of invisibility, remembering their dismissive glances and the weight of being labeled a failure. But I learned to channel that pain into focus. Humiliation no longer broke me. It guided me. Betrayal no longer weakened me. It sharpened me. And every tear I had shed in silence became fuel for the battles I would fight with patience and precision. Then came the pivotal moment. A family meeting was scheduled regarding Lily's new house and shared assets. I attended, calm, composed, and deliberate. My parents assumed I would be deferential, perhaps apologetic, maybe even quietly envious of Lily's fortune. They underestimated me. I presented my findings, carefully documented evidence of favoritism, mismanagement, and intentional exclusion, without raising my voice or showing malice. The room fell into stunned silence. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes darted nervously. Lily looked confused, unsure why the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically. Every piece of paper, every reference, every subtle expose I delivered was a revelation. The family who had called me a failure could no longer ignore my presence, my intelligence, or my power. It was not an easy victory. There were tense moments, attempts to gaslight me, half-hearted defenses, and even threats of ignoring my claims. But I was prepared. I had built my argument meticulously, backed by evidence and strategy, and I refused to be intimidated. Every confrontation, every challenge, was met with patience and resolve. I was no longer the sister they could manipulate at will. By the end of the meeting, the power dynamic had shifted. My parents' confidence had faltered, their favoritism exposed, their authority questioned. Lily's illusions of entitlement began to wobble. And I realized that the true victory wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about reclaiming my narrative, proving my worth, and demonstrating that humiliation can be transformed into power when met with clarity, strategy, and resilience. That night, I reflected on everything. I understood that humiliation, betrayal, and favoritism are not permanent shackles unless you let them be. Power doesn't always come from force. It comes from patience, preparation, and courage. And I had discovered that even when life labels you a failure, you have the choice to rise, to reclaim your story, and to show the world your strength. I had turned my pain into strategy, my sorrow into focus, and my humiliation into a roadmap for empowerment. And I knew that the final act, the moral closure, the complete reclamation of my life and dignity, was approaching. The days that followed felt surreal, as if I were walking in a world that had subtly shifted to acknowledge my presence. The humiliation of being labeled the family failure no longer had power over me. My parents' casual favoritism toward Lily, the sneers and dismissive comments, they existed only as reminders of the fire that had forged me. I had survived, strategized, and reclaimed my narrative. It wasn't just about money or recognition anymore. I had built my own foundation, quietly but steadily. Freelance projects growing into contracts, investments I had made independently, relationships nurtured on trust and respect. I was no longer competing with Lily or seeking approval from my parents. I was building a life entirely my own. Then came the final confrontation, though it wasn't loud or violent. It was subtle, deliberate, a demonstration of truth rather than vengeance. I invited my parents to review some shared investments, under the guise of reconciliation. They arrived, confident, assuming I would be meek, apologetic, perhaps envious. But the woman they had dismissed as a failure had become someone unshakable, composed, and precise. I laid out the facts, evidence of favoritism, financial manipulation, and the ways I had been sidelined. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I simply presented truth, letting it speak for itself. I watched their faces shift, astonishment, discomfort, a dawning realization that they had underestimated me. Lily, too, seemed taken aback, realizing for the first time that her privilege had been enforced at someone else's expense. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Every calculated step, every sleepless night, every ounce of effort had been invested in reclaiming control over my life, my dignity, and my story. I had transformed humiliation into empowerment, and betrayal into strategy. The labels they had assigned to me, failure, disappointment, were irrelevant now. After that meeting, the atmosphere in the family changed. My parents treated me with caution, a subtle respect replacing their previous condescension. Lily, once oblivious, began to see the fragility of her own entitlement. And I felt a quiet triumph, not one fueled by malice, but by integrity, persistence, and strength. I spent that night reflecting on the journey. I realized that humiliation, betrayal, and exclusion are not permanent unless you allow them to define you. Power doesn't always come from anger or aggression. It comes from clarity, patience, preparation, and courage. I had discovered my resilience, and in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my narrative but my future. Months later, I found myself walking through my own apartment, a space I had furnished with care and independence. My life was no longer a reflection of my parents' favoritism. It was a manifestation of my ambition, intelligence, and perseverance. Every wall, every light, every corner reminded me that I was in control. I had learned the ultimate lesson: humiliation does not define your worth, betrayal does not determine your destiny. True power lies in reclaiming your story, in standing firm when the world doubts you, and in turning every setback into an opportunity to rise. As I looked out the window at the city lights, I felt a sense of closure I had never known. The woman who once sat in silence, labeled a failure, was gone. In her place stood someone who had endured, who had observed, who had acted with purpose and patience, and who had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakable. The fire of humiliation that had once burned me now illuminated my path. I understood with deep certainty that life does not define us by the cruelty we endure. It defines us by the courage with which we rise, the dignity we reclaim, and the strength we cultivate within. I smiled, not with vindictiveness, but with peace. My parents' money had not dictated my future. Their labels had not defined me. I had taken control, reclaimed my power, and built a life on my own terms. And in that quiet, steady triumph, I finally felt truly free.